Nathan Caldwell signed the divorce papers on a Tuesday morning and took Vanessa Blake to brunch by noon. He ordered champagne. He told the waiter they were celebrating. Vanessa laughed and pressed her hand against his chest and said, "You deserve so much better than what you had." Nathan agreed. He had spent 10 years married to a woman who sketched buildings in notebooks at the kitchen table while he built a career, made connections, climbed. Elena Hart had been quiet and steady and completely, utterly unremarkable, and now she was gone, and Nathan felt nothing but relief. If this story hits close to home, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. The invitation had arrived 6 weeks before the gala, and Nathan had held it like a trophy. The Hargrove Foundation Annual Gala, an evening honoring vision, legacy, and transformative leadership in the arts. Black tie. The Meridian Grand Hotel on Fifth Avenue. Every name on the guest list was either a CEO, a major donor, or someone whose last name was printed on the side of a building. Nathan Caldwell was none of those things. Not yet. But his firm, Westbridge Capital Partners, had recently landed a partnership with the Hargrove Foundation's investment arm, and his managing director, Gerald Fitch, had included Nathan's name on the firm's reservation almost as an afterthought. Nathan chose not to see it that way. He chose to see it as a rival. He'd spent 3 weeks selecting his tuxedo, a charcoal brioni, slim cut, paired with a white shirt so crisp it barely moved when he breathed. Vanessa had helped him pick the cufflinks, brushed gold, understated, and had pressed a kiss to his jaw in the fitting room mirror and said, "You look like someone they should all know." That sentence had lived rent-free in his head ever since. He was 43 years old, recently divorced, newly visible, and standing in the lobby of the Meridian Grand on a cold October evening with a woman 11 years younger than him on his arm, and he felt, for the first time in a long time, like the best version of himself. Vanessa Blake was beautiful in the particular way that makes rooms go quiet. Thick dark hair pinned up with a few deliberate strands loose at her temples. A deep burgundy gown with a low back that she wore with total ease, as if she'd been wearing gowns like that her whole life, which she had not. She was a marketing coordinator at a mid-level lifestyle brand. But she had the gift of presence, and Nathan had mistaken that gift for substance. Most people did, at first. "You nervous?" she asked him, squeezing his arm as they moved through the lobby toward the main ballroom. "Not even a little," Nathan said. That was mostly true. He had the low hum of anticipation that he'd learned to manage over the years, the kind that sharpened his smile and straightened his posture. He'd been to events like this before, though not quite at this level. The Hargrove Gala was a different tier, the kind where you didn't talk about what you did for a living. You talked about what you were building, what you believed in, what legacy meant to you. Nathan had rehearsed his answers. The ballroom was everything the invitation had promised. Vaulted ceilings with panels of hand-painted gold leaf. Chandeliers that cast everything in warm amber. Round tables set for 10 with centerpieces that looked like they cost more than Nathan's first car. A string quartet in the far corner playing something Nathan didn't recognize but nodded to anyway. Waitstaff moving through the crowd with a practiced silence, offering champagne and small plates of things that were designed to look simple but weren't. Nathan took 2 glasses from a passing tray, handed one to Vanessa, and began to survey the room with the focused calm of a man conducting an inventory. Gerald Fitch was already there, 61, silver-haired, the kind of man who wore a tuxedo like a second skin, talking to a woman Nathan recognized as a city council member. Nathan made a mental note to drift in that direction within the next 20 minutes, long enough for Gerald to notice him without it looking engineered. There were hedge fund partners, a real estate developer whose name was on 3 Manhattan towers, 2 or 3 faces Nathan recognized from financial news coverage, a documentary filmmaker who'd won something significant last year, the usual constellations of New York power orbiting each other with the relaxed confidence of people who knew their gravity. Nathan belonged here. He told himself that clearly and completely. "This is incredible," Vanessa breathed beside him. She was doing that thing she did at events like this, where her voice dropped slightly and her eyes got a little wider, and Nathan found it charming when they were alone but mildly irritating in public, though he never said so. "It's nice," he said, which was his version of agreeing. They moved through the room. Nathan introduced himself to two people he didn't know, made a clean, easy impression, mentioned Westbridge without overselling it. He was good at this. The frictionless social machinery of ambition. He'd been practicing it since his 20s, honing it through a decade of marriage to a woman who hated these kinds of events and would stand at the edge of any room they attended together, quiet and watchful, sometimes taking out a small notebook and sketching whatever caught her eye until Nathan asked her, more than once, to please just put it away because it looked odd. He hadn't thought about Elena once since the morning. That wasn't entirely accurate. He thought about her briefly when he was knotting his tie because she used to do it for him, and for a second his hands remembered that. But he'd pushed it aside quickly. Elena was wherever Elena was. Probably in that apartment she'd taken in Brooklyn, the one her sister had helped her find, doing whatever she did when no one was asking anything of her. He hoped she was fine. He genuinely did. He wasn't a cruel man, Nathan Caldwell. He had simply outgrown things. People outgrew things. That was life. "Is that the senator's chief of staff?" Vanessa whispered, angling her head toward a cluster near the far wall. "Probably," Nathan said. "Don't stare." They found their table assignments. Nathan had been placed at table 9, which he noted was not a primary table but was adjacent to the foundation's board members, which he decided to interpret optimistically. He and Vanessa took their seats, introduced themselves to the couple already seated across from them. A pleasant pair from Boston, he in real estate, she in nonprofit administration, and settled into the easy, manageable rhythms of pre-dinner small talk. The evening was going exactly the way Nathan had wanted it to go. He was explaining the Westbridge portfolio restructuring to the man from Boston, tactfully, not boringly, when he noticed the shift. It happened the way atmospheric pressure changes before a storm. Not a sound, exactly, but a change in sound. The room didn't go quiet all at once. It went quiet in waves, starting somewhere near the entrance and rolling inward, table by table, conversation by conversation, until the string quartet was the only thing Nathan could actually hear. He turned toward the entrance. Damian Blackwell had arrived. Nathan recognized him immediately, though he'd never met the man in person. Damian Blackwell was one of those figures who existed in the financial world the way certain weather systems existed, large, unmistakable, and impossible to ignore once you understood what you were looking at. 61 years old. Founder of Blackwell Global Ventures, which had seed-funded something like 40 significant projects in the last 2 decades, including a waterfront cultural district in Rotterdam and a performing arts center in Sao Paulo that had been on the cover of 3 architecture magazines in the same year. His personal net worth was somewhere in the range that stopped being relatable, and he was known, distinctly, unusually, for actually caring about the things he funded. He was also, Nathan noted, considerably better looking in person than in photographs. Tall, broad, entirely at ease in a room full of people who were trying to look at ease. Gray at his temples, a face that had aged the way faces age on men who have spent time outdoors and don't particularly worry about it, and a quality of stillness that Nathan recognized as the particular confidence of someone who had stopped needing to prove anything to anyone a long time ago. Nathan registered all of this in about 4 seconds. Then his gaze moved, as everyone's gaze in the room was moving, to the woman beside him. The recognition came in stages. The first stage was, "She's extraordinary." This arrived as pure sensory data. The line of her shoulders, the way she moved, something in the angle of her chin that Nathan's brain categorized as authority before he'd consciously processed anything else. The second stage, arriving a half-second later, was the dress. Midnight blue silk, clean and architectural, with a simplicity so precise it could only be expensive. Her hair, dark, worn loose, falling past her shoulders in a way that was deliberately uncomplicated. Diamond earrings, small, the kind you chose because you didn't need the earrings to do the talking. The third stage was when his chest stopped working for a moment, because the woman walking into the Hargrove Gala on Damian Blackwell's arm, drawing every eye in the room, carrying herself with the easy certainty of someone who had not merely arrived but had chosen to arrive, was Elena. Elena Hart, his ex-wife. Nathan's champagne glass touched down on the table with a small, inelegant clink that Vanessa noticed. "You okay?" she said. He didn't answer. He watched Elena move through the room, the way you watch something you don't entirely believe is happening. She was smiling at something Damian said, Not the polite smile she'd worn at events Nathan had brought her to, the one that never quite reached her eyes, the one that said, "I would rather be working." But something real, something unhurried, the smile of a person who is exactly where they want to be. She didn't look around the room the way people look around rooms at galas, clocking exits and familiar faces, and whether anyone important had noticed them. She looked forward. She looked settled. She looked, and this was the thing that Nathan could not quite metabolize, happy in a way he wasn't sure he had ever seen her. "Who is that?" the woman from Boston said. "The one with Blackwell. She looks familiar." "I'm not sure," her husband said. Nathan said nothing. Yet, he had told himself a particular story about his marriage, and he had told it so many times and in so many small ways that it had become fact in his mind. The story went like this. Nathan had worked hard and built something real, and Elena had been there, supportive in her quiet way, but had never quite matched his ambition, never quite moved at his speed, never wanted what he wanted. She was content in ways that he found ultimately constraining. Her architecture work was a passion project, something she cared about but never fully committed to. She took small commissions, renovation consulting, an occasional commercial interior, and when Nathan suggested she might consider something with more earning potential, she would get that look, patient and closed off, and change the subject. He had loved her. He wanted to be clear about that, at least in his own internal accounting. He had loved her the way you love something comfortable and familiar, and ultimately insufficient. They had stopped touching each other the way people in love touched each other. He wasn't sure when that had happened. It had happened gradually, then completely, the way most things between them had happened. The affair with Vanessa had started 14 months before the divorce. Nathan had not intended it to become what it became. He had told himself this for a long time, and then he had stopped telling himself anything and just let it be what it was, which was easier. When he finally asked Elena for a divorce, she had been sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee and a drafting pad, drawing something that looked like the skeleton of a large building, all clean lines and careful measurements, and she had looked up at him and said, "Okay." Just that. Okay. He'd expected something more, some version of devastation, even a quiet one, something that confirmed he was worth devastating over. She had set her pencil down on the table and said, "Okay," and then asked him if he wanted her to find a lawyer or if he'd already retained one. He had already retained one. She had nodded, and that was largely how it went. She had not cried in front of him. She had not thrown anything. She had not called him at 2 a.m. with questions or recriminations. She had consulted with her lawyer, responded promptly to every document, and moved out of their apartment in Midtown within 30 days with a thoroughness that Nathan found, inexplicably, slightly insulting. Her sister Claire had called him once, about 2 weeks after Elena left, and said, "You have no idea what you just walked away from." Nathan had said something civil and hung up the phone and decided that Claire had always been difficult. He had not wondered seriously about what Elena was doing. He had not wondered about the sketchbook she'd left behind, the 3 of them in the hall closet, which he'd boxed up and given to her building's doorman without opening. He had not wondered about the project she'd mentioned, obliquely, a few weeks before the divorce. Something about a commission, something larger than what she usually took. He had not asked. He had been very busy arriving. "What?" "Nathan!" The voice came from his left. Gerald Fitch had materialized beside the table, champagne in hand, his expression doing something that Nathan couldn't immediately classify. "Gerald." Nathan stood, extended his hand. "Glad you made it." Gerald's eyes moved briefly, involuntarily, toward the entrance, where Elena and Damian Blackwell were now being approached by 3 separate people: the head of the Hargrove Foundation Board, a woman Nathan recognized as a prominent arts journalist, and someone else he couldn't place. "Hell of an evening already." "It is," Nathan said. Gerald looked at him. "You know her?" Nathan's jaw worked once. "We've met." "Blackwell doesn't bring people to things," Gerald said, keeping his voice low, conversational, but with an undercurrent of something that made Nathan's neck prickle. "He's famously private. Hasn't had a Publix anything in years." He watched the small gathering around Elena and Damien with the expression of a man recalibrating several things at once. "Do you know what she does?" "She's an architect," Nathan said. "She's more than that," Gerald said. I did some reading when the foundation announced the Van Thorpe Museum project. The lead design consultant on that expansion is a woman named Elena Hart. The Van Thorpe expansion is the largest privately funded cultural infrastructure project in the Northeast in 20 years. Blackwell Global is the primary investment vehicle. He paused. Hart Design Studio. She founded it about 18 months ago. 18 months ago, Nathan had been filing divorce papers. I wasn't aware of that, Nathan said. It was the most honest sentence he had said all evening, and he said it to the floor. Come on. Vanessa had gone to find the restroom, which Nathan was grateful for. He needed 2 minutes to sit with what was happening in his chest. A dull, spreading pressure that wasn't grief exactly, and wasn't jealousy exactly, but was something in the same neighborhood as both. He watched Elena across the room. She was speaking to the arts journalist now, the one from the foundation, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and a recorder in her handbag that she had not yet reached for because she was too busy listening. Elena was using her hands when she talked, that thing she did when she was genuinely engaged with something, drawing shapes in the air, sketching invisible lines with her fingers. The journalist was leaning in. Damian Blackwell stood slightly to Elena's right, talking to the foundation board chair, but his attention was never fully off her. Not possessively, not like someone monitoring a valuable asset, but the way you pay attention to something you actually find interesting, which Nathan recognized because he had once paid attention to Elena that way, years ago, before familiarity had convinced him that she was simply ordinary. He had a particular memory, sudden and unwelcome, of sitting across from her at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning about 4 years into their marriage. She'd been working on a proposal for a small community arts center in Queens, a project she was doing essentially pro bono, and she'd been talking about it, the acoustics, the sight lines, the way natural light would work with the internal architecture. And Nathan had been half listening, looking at his phone, saying, at appropriate intervals. And at some point she had stopped talking mid-sentence, and he had looked up, and she had been looking at him with an expression he hadn't known how to read at the time. He was starting to think he understood it now. You're not listening. You've never been listening. Dinner was served at 8:30. Nathan ate without tasting anything. He was 3 tables away from Elena, close enough to catch fragments of conversation when the background noise thinned. She was talking about load-bearing cantilever structures with an engineer whose name Nathan didn't catch, using terminology that was precise and specific and entirely her own. And the engineer was arguing back with the particular enthusiasm of someone who had found an actual peer. Vanessa came back from the restroom and Nathan smiled at her, and she squeezed his hand, and he thought about how she had once said that Elena didn't seem like his type, and he had agreed. You're quiet, Vanessa said. Just taking it in, Nathan said. Is someone here bothering you? He looked at her. She had followed his gaze earlier. He was nearly certain of it. She was clever enough to know that something was off, and experienced enough with him not to push directly. No, Nathan said. Everything is fine. Vanessa smiled. It was a slightly smaller smile than the one she'd arrived with. And Nathan noticed that too, and filed it away under things he didn't have space for tonight. The foundation's executive director took the podium at 9:15 for the evening's formal remarks. The usual sequence: gratitude, vision, impact, acknowledgement of major donors. Nathan listened with his hands folded on the table, the posture of a man paying attention, which he was, but to the wrong things. He was tracking Elena across the room, watching the small movements of her face as she listened to the remarks, the way she had her head tilted slightly to one side, the way she always did when she was genuinely interested in something. He had forgotten that about her. The head tilt. The way it looked when she was actually engaged versus the way she looked when she was being politely present. He had spent 10 years reading those two expressions incorrectly. The director concluded his remarks and handed the microphone to Damian Blackwell. Blackwell did not speak the way men with power often spoke at events like this, with the cadence of someone performing accessibility, making their wealth feel approachable. He spoke the way someone spoke when they genuinely had something to say and were not particularly worried about how it landed. He spoke about the Van Thorpe Museum expansion project. He spoke about what it meant to invest in cultural infrastructure, not as patronage, not as legacy building, but as a genuine conviction that the spaces in which a society chose to encounter beauty and history said something real about what that society believed it was worth. The design at the center of this project, Blackwell said, is one of the most sophisticated and quietly radical pieces of architectural thinking I've encountered in 20 years of funding creative work. It solves problems that most architects wouldn't have noticed were problems in the first place. It was brought to me by a person whose vision I am, frankly, still catching up with. He paused. The room was completely still. Elena Hart, he said, who most of you are about to start fighting over. There was laughter, warm, genuine, and then there was sustained applause, and Nathan watched Elena receive it. She didn't stand immediately. She sat for a half second, the way she always sat when she was processing something, and then she stood and turned slightly toward the room, and she was smiling, but it wasn't a performed smile, and it wasn't a modest smile, and it wasn't the smile of someone who had been waiting for this moment and savoring its arrival. It was just real. The expression of someone who knew what they'd built, had always known, and was allowing other people the experience of catching up. Nathan's hands were pressed flat against the tablecloth. Gerald Fitch, seated 2 tables over, turned and found Nathan's face in the crowd. The look he gave Nathan was not unkind. It was worse than unkind. It was the look of a man who had just reordered a set of facts and arrived somewhere he hadn't expected. It was the look of someone doing the maths. Nathan excused himself during the dessert course. He told Vanessa he needed air, which was true, and walked through the side corridor past the coat check and out through a service door onto a narrow terrace that overlooked the hotel's interior courtyard. The city noise filtered up from 5 stories below. Horns, sirens, the low, persistent bass of 10 million people going about their evening. He stood there for a while with his hands in his jacket pockets. He thought about the sketchbooks. There had been more than 3. He remembered now. There had been at least 6 or 7 filled over years, stacked in the back of the hall closet, along with old tax files and a box of cables for devices they no longer owned. He had given the 3 he'd found in the closet to Elena's doorman. He could not remember what had happened to the others. He thought about the afternoon, maybe 2 years before the divorce, when Elena had come home from a site visit in Long Island City. She'd been consulting on a small mixed-use building, one of those jobs she took to keep her hand in, she'd told him. And she'd had this particular energy, restless and electric, the kind she got when something had clicked for her. She'd dropped her bag in the hallway and said, "Nathan, I think I figured out something about the facade treatment that could actually..." And he had said from behind his laptop, "Can you give me 10 minutes?" And she had said, "Of course." And when he'd looked up 20 minutes later, she was in the other room with her drafting pad, and he had not asked her what she'd figured out. He had never asked her what she'd figured out. He stood on the terrace in his Brioni tuxedo with the city humming beneath him and held that particular memory at arm's length, the way you hold something sharp. Inside, through the glass panels of the terrace door, he could see the ballroom. The applause had died down. The evening had returned to its warm, champagne-bright social motion. He could see Vanessa at their table, talking to the couple from Boston, performing her easy charm. He could see Gerald Fitch moving through the room with the alert focus of a man who had identified something worth pursuing. He could see Elena, across the room, head tilted, talking to someone new. She had not looked for him once all evening, not watched once. He had been in the same room with her for 2 hours, and she had not searched the crowd for his face, had not registered his presence with any visible shift in her posture or expression, had not, as far as he could tell, thought about him at all. Nathan Caldwell had believed, with the quiet certainty of a man who had never seriously examined his own assumptions, that when Elena was done being sad about the divorce, she would return to an ordinary life, a smaller life, the kind of life that confirmed retrospectively that his choice had been right. He had been wrong about so many things, and only some of them were becoming clear to him tonight. He pushed the terrace door open and walked back inside, because standing in the cold and feeling things was not something Nathan Caldwell had a great deal of practice with, and he didn't know how to do it gracefully. So he did what he knew how to do. He straightened his jacket, picked up his posture, and went back to the table. Vanessa looked up when he sat down. She searched his face for a moment with her dark eyes, and whatever she found there made her look away. The string quartet had shifted to something slower. Nathan reached for his champagne glass and found it empty. The champagne waiter came by again, and Nathan held out his glass without looking up. He watched the refill happen. the pale gold liquid rising, and then set the glass down without drinking from it. Vanessa had excused herself again. That was the third time in 2 hours, which was unusual for her. She was social in the way that required an audience, and leaving the table meant leaving the room, which was something Vanessa generally resisted at events where being seen was the point. Nathan noticed the pattern without naming it. He was doing a lot of that tonight, noticing things, filing them sideways, not dealing with any of them directly. The couple from Boston had found someone else to talk to. Nathan was alone at the table in the specific way that only happens at large gatherings, surrounded by noise and motion, completely separate from all of it. Across the room, Elena was still standing with the group that had assembled around her and Damian Blackwell after the remarks. The cluster had expanded, 8 people now, maybe 9, and it had the organic density of a conversation that nobody wanted to be the first to leave. Nathan could see the arts journalist from earlier, the one who had been leaning in. She had her recorder out now. Elena was talking, one hand tracing something in the air, and the journalist was nodding and writing and nodding again. Nathan had been to dozens of events like this over the years. He knew what it looked like when someone was being interviewed because they were the interesting person's partner, and he knew what it looked like when someone was being interviewed because they were the reason people had come. This was the second thing. He picked up his champagne and finally drank. Gerald Fitch materialized at the empty chair beside him with the particular smoothness of a man who had been waiting for the right moment. "Mind if I sit?" "Go ahead," Nathan said. Gerald settled in, set his own glass down, looked out at the room for a moment. He had the manner of someone who was not in a hurry, which was misleading because Gerald Fitch was always in a hurry. He just did it quietly. "Art Design Studio," Gerald said. 18 months old, already the lead design consultancy on a $240 million cultural infrastructure project. He wasn't looking at Nathan. He was watching the crowd with the mild, assessing expression he wore during earnings calls. Blackwell doesn't move on cultural projects below $50 million. He said so in interviews. This one is nearly 5 times that. Nathan said nothing. "The Vanthorpe expansion breaks ground in March," Gerald continued. "The board is talking about the international press coverage as a cultural moment. Not just an architecture story, but something that gets taken up by mainstream outlets. Urban planning journals have already run preliminary coverage. There's a documentary in development." He finally turned to look at Nathan. That kind of visibility, the right firm attached to that kind of visibility, would be worth more than most mid-size capital partners make in a year of placements. Nathan set his glass down. "What are you saying, Gerald?" "I'm saying," Gerald said carefully, "that the woman you were married to is about to become one of the most prominent creative figures in this city. I'm saying that Blackwell Global has relationships with 7 of our top 12 clients." He paused. "I'm saying that it would have been useful to know this before tonight." There it was. Nathan had known it was coming, had heard the shape of it in the way Gerald had looked at him across the room 40 minutes ago. But hearing it said, plainly, without softening, landed differently than he'd expected. "I didn't know," Nathan said. "She didn't—" He stopped. He had been about to say she didn't tell me, which was technically accurate, but the moment it was in his mouth it tasted like the wrong answer. She hadn't told him, but he also hadn't asked. Gerald seemed to understand the incomplete sentence without needing the rest of it. He looked back out at the room. 10 years is a long time, he said. Not cruelly, just as a fact. "It is," Nathan said. "People can surprise you." Nathan laughed, once, short. "Yeah." Gerald stood, straightened his jacket, picked up his glass. "We'll talk Monday." He put enough weight on talk that it wasn't really about talking, and then he moved away, absorbed back into the room, and Nathan was alone again. He thought about Monday. He thought about what "we'll talk" meant coming from a managing director who had just watched his firm's recently divorced associate sit in the same ballroom as a woman who was apparently redefining the city's cultural infrastructure and had not mentioned it once in the 6 weeks since the invitations had gone out. He thought about whether there was any version of Monday that ended well. He didn't come up with one. Vanessa found him about 10 minutes later. She came back to the table from the direction of the bar, rather than the restrooms, which told him something, and she was carrying a fresh drink she hadn't asked if he wanted. She sat down, crossed her legs, looked out at the room with an expression Nathan had not seen on her before. something flatter than her usual manner, something that had been thinking while she was away. "That's her, isn't it?" Vanessa said. She wasn't asking. Nathan turned to look at her. "Your ex-wife," Vanessa said. "The architect." "Yes," Nathan said, because lying required more energy than he had left tonight. Vanessa nodded slowly. She took a sip of whatever she'd gotten from the bar, something amber, not champagne, and looked across the room at Elena with an expression that Nathan could not immediately categorize. "She's different than I pictured," Vanessa said. "What did you picture?" "I don't know. You never talked about her much." She turned the glass in her hands. "You said she was quiet, that she was more interested in work than in being present, I think you said." Nathan remembered saying something like that. He had said a version of it several times to several people in the months after the divorce. It had been part of the story he'd told. Elena was distant. Elena was contained. Elena had retreated into her work and left him in a marriage that had essentially already ended long before he asked for the divorce. He had believed it when he said it. "She doesn't look quiet," Vanessa said. "She isn't," Nathan said before he decided to say it. She always knew what she thought. She just didn't usually share it unless you actually asked." Vanessa turned to look at him. It was a particular kind of look. Not hostile, not wounded, but the look of someone reassessing a story they'd been told, checking it against new information. "Did you ask?" she said. Nathan picked up his champagne. "Not enough," he said. He hadn't meant to say that either. It was the truest thing he'd said all evening, and it came out almost by accident, the way true things sometimes did when you'd stopped actively managing yourself. Vanessa looked away. She didn't respond, and he didn't add to it, and they sat for a while in the kind of quiet that meant they were both thinking something neither of them wanted to be the first to say out loud. At some point, the table filled back up. Other guests returning from the bar, the drift of the room redistributing itself. And Nathan found himself in conversation with a woman named Patricia Sohn, who turned out to be an urban planning consultant who had worked in various capacities with 3 different city administrations over 20 years. She was in her 60s, sharp, and she had apparently been at the table for the first part of the evening without Nathan fully registering her, which she seemed entirely unbothered by. She brought up the Vanthorpe project. Not because she knew about Nathan's connection to Elena. As far as Patricia Sohn was concerned, Nathan was simply a capital partner at a mid-level firm who happened to be seated near her. She brought it up because it was the thing people in her field were talking about, had been talking about for months, and because Damien Blackwell's remarks had crystallized something she'd been thinking. "The interesting thing about the heart design," Patricia said, and Nathan registered the use of the heart design as though it were already shorthand, already established, already something that people in rooms like this knew, is that it doesn't solve the problem everyone assumed needed solving. Most expansion projects for cultural institutions that size are trying to add square footage. Heart's design is actually about sightline management and temporal flow, the way visitors move through a space over time. It's a fundamentally different approach to the problem. Temporal flow, Nathan said, the way a building guides your attention, what you see, when, in what order, and how that affects your experience of everything else. Patricia held her glass loosely, the way academics held things. Most architects think about space. She thinks about time. She paused, or at least that's how the coverage has read it, and the rendering seemed to support it. Nathan thought about the sketchbooks. He thought about the Sunday afternoons Elena had spent at the kitchen table. He thought about the facade treatment she had wanted to tell him about, 4 years ago, the thing she had figured out. He thought about the sketchbooks she'd kept year after year, full of drawings he'd seen the covers of but never looked inside. Temporal flow. How a building guided your attention. What you saw when. "Have you met her?" Nathan asked. "Not yet," Patricia said. "Tonight, hopefully." She looked across the room with the genuine interest of a professional peer. She gave a talk at the Urban Design Forum in March. I couldn't attend, but several colleagues did. The feedback was, she searched for the word, galvanizing, I think is how one of them put it. She smiled. That doesn't happen at Urban Design Forum talks, as a rule. But Nathan said he could imagine. He was no longer entirely sure what he was doing at this table, at this event, in this version of his life. The certainty he had arrived with, the settled confidence of a man at the top of the arc he'd been climbing, had been quietly, thoroughly disassembled over the last 3 hours. And what was left in its place was not grief and not anger and not anything clean enough to name. It was something more like recognition, slow and unpleasant. Vanessa left the table again at 10:15. This time she said she was going to find someone she recognized from across the room, a friend of a friend, someone from her industry. She said it with a precise social ease that Nathan recognized as performed, the same performance he'd watched her give all evening, but directed inward now rather than outward. He didn't try to stop her. He watched her move it through the crowd toward a cluster of younger guests near the back of the room. People in their early 30s, the kind who had come with someone important and were killing time among each other. And he thought about what she had asked him. Did you ask? He had met Vanessa Blake at a client dinner 16 months into the affair. Before the affair, technically, though they'd been circling each other for weeks before that. She had been seated across the table from him at a restaurant in Tribeca, and she had told a story about a marketing campaign gone wrong with such precise comic timing that Nathan had laughed genuinely for the first time in months. He had thought, she's exactly what I've been missing. He had not thought, what am I missing in myself that makes her feel like a solution? He was thinking about it now. The problem with Insight arrived late was that it arrived after the choices. After the papers were signed and the apartments changed and the champagne was ordered at brunch to mark the occasion. After you'd told enough people a version of the story that felt like the real one. After you'd spent a year building a life around the conclusion you'd reached about the previous life. Nathan was 43 years old and sitting in the Meridian Grand surrounded by the most professionally ambitious people he'd ever been in a room with. And the thing he felt most clearly was not ambition. It was the particular loneliness of realizing you'd made yourself into someone you couldn't entirely respect, and not having a clear path back from there. Damian Blackwell moved through the room with the ease of a man who knew everyone would come to him if he waited long enough, which was true. He stopped at tables, exchanged a few words, moved on. He had the social rhythm of someone who was genuinely interested in people, but also clear about his own time, a combination that Nathan had always admired in theory and rarely managed in practice. At one point, Blackwell was 3 tables from Nathan, talking to the hedge fund partner Nathan had noticed earlier, and Nathan was close enough to observe him without observing Elena, which felt like a small mercy. Then Elena appeared beside Blackwell, touching his arm briefly, not possessively, just locating him, and said something near his ear. Blackwell laughed. Not a polite laugh. An actual one. The kind that changed his face. And Elena looked up from whatever she'd said, and her eyes moved across the room in the natural sweep of someone in a crowded space. The unconscious visual survey. And for a second, a single, distinct second, her gaze landed on Nathan. She found him immediately. As if she'd known where he was all along. Her expression didn't change. It didn't go cold or careful or closed the way he'd half expected. It didn't do anything dramatic. She just looked at him for a moment, steady, unhurried, with the expression of someone who had prepared for this possibility and found, upon encountering it, that she was prepared. Then she looked away. Back to Blackwell, back to the room, back to the conversation she'd been having, smooth and continuous, as though Nathan were simply part of the room's furniture, not painful to look at, not worth looking away from dramatically, just there. A fact, like the chandeliers and the tablecloths and the sound of the string quartet. Nathan felt it like a hand pressed flat against his sternum, not the looking away. But sometime around 10:40, the formal evening began to loosen. People pushed back from tables. The string quartet transitioned into something livelier. Small groups consolidated and dispersed. The subtle architecture of the evening, dinner, remarks, structured mingling, gave way to the unstructured end of the night, where conversations got longer and more honest, and the room sorted itself into the people who were ready to leave and the people who had nowhere they'd rather be. Nathan was still at the table. He was on his 3rd or 4th, he'd lost count, glass of champagne, which was 2 more than he usually allowed himself at professional events. And he was watching the room with the deliberate focus of a man who was not particularly interested in what he was seeing, but needed something to look at. Gerald had not come back to the table. Vanessa had not come back from wherever she'd gone. Patricia Sohn had been collected by a colleague and moved to a different part of the room, and the couple from Boston had long since migrated elsewhere. And Nathan was in the particular situation of being alone at a table for 10 without the social scaffolding of anyone who was nominally there for him. He thought about leaving. He calculated the exit, say goodnight to Gerald, find Vanessa, retrieve their coats, get a car. 15 minutes, maybe. He could do it in 15 minutes. He did not move. He was watching Elena again. He could not seem to stop watching Elena, not with longing, not exactly, and not with the self-pitying nostalgia of a man who regretted losing something. It was more precise than that. He was watching her the way you watched something that was teaching you something about yourself, something you needed to see, even though the learning was uncomfortable. She was talking to a man Nathan didn't recognize, mid-50s, strong handshake energy, the kind of posture that said structural engineer or developer. They were having an animated disagreement about something that kept making both of them smile, the kind of argument that was really enthusiasm wearing the shape of opposition. Elena was doing the hand thing again, tracing lines in the air, making her point in the physical language of someone who thought spatially, who lived in 3 dimensions even when the room was just a room. He had made fun of that once, not cruelly. He hadn't thought he was being cruel. But he had said, after a dinner party where Elena had spent an hour talking to someone's architect cousin in the kitchen, "You really can't help yourself, can you?" And she had said quietly, "No." And he had meant it as a mild joke about her single-mindedness, but she had heard it as something else, something closer to what he'd actually meant, which was, "You care too much about this one thing and not enough about the other things I want you to care about." She had been right to hear it that way. The man she was talking to produced a business card from his jacket pocket and offered it with a gesture that was clearly professional, the gesture of someone who wanted to stay in this conversation beyond the evening. Elena took it, glanced at it, said something that made the man nod vigorously, and put it in a small clutch he hadn't noticed her carrying. He was probably the 4th or 5th person tonight to give her a card. Nathan had not given anyone a card. "There you are," Vanessa's voice came from behind him. She appeared at his shoulder and sat down closer to him than she'd been sitting most of the night. And when she looked at him, her expression had that flatness again. The thoughtful one, but softer now, something more uncertain in it. "I've been sitting here," Nathan said. "I know." She looked out at the room, then back at him. "I talked to someone from the foundation about the Vanthorpe project." She said it carefully, watching him. Nathan didn't respond. "She said the heart design won the commission over 8 other firms," Vanessa continued, "including 2 firms that have been doing this kind of work for 30 years. She said the committee voted unanimously." She paused. "She said the proposal was the kind of thing that made people in the room feel like they'd been looking at architecture wrong their whole careers." Nathan turned his glass on the tablecloth. "Vanessa, I'm not saying it to hurt you," she said. And she wasn't. He could hear that. She was saying it with the discomfort of someone who had gone looking for information and found more than they'd been prepared for. I wanted to understand what was happening tonight. Why you've been so..." She moved her hand in a vague, encompassing gesture. "Wherever you've been." "I've been here," Nathan said. "No," Vanessa said. "You really haven't." He looked at her. She looked back steadily, and he saw something in her face that he hadn't expected. Not accusation, not jealousy, but something honest. The face of someone who had started the evening with one idea about what she was doing here and was ending it with a different one. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to actually answer. Okay? Did you know what she was capable of?" The question sat between them. Nathan opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I knew," he said finally. "I think I knew. He stopped. The sentence had 4 or 5 different endings, and none of them were good. "I just didn't take it seriously. I just didn't think it mattered. I just thought what she wanted was smaller than what I wanted, and I never questioned that, and she never insisted, and so it became true in our house, even though it was never true in her." He settled for, "I didn't pay attention." Vanessa nodded slowly. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's a terrible answer." "Yeah," Nathan said, "it is." At 11, the Hargrove Foundation director took the podium one last time to close the evening with a brief acknowledgement of the night's key conversations and an announcement about the Vanthorpe project's official groundbreaking ceremony scheduled for the following March. "We hope many of you will join us," the director said. "It is, we believe, the beginning of something that will redefine how this city thinks about the relationship between built space and lived experience." Applause. Warm, genuine, the particular warmth of a room full of people who had been moved by something and were ready to go home carrying it. Nathan clapped. He was not sure why. The automatic motion of a man in a crowd. He watched Elena accept the room's attention one final time from across the ballroom. She was standing beside Damian Blackwell, and she was smiling, and she looked, he kept coming back to this, kept turning it over, like someone who had arrived exactly where she intended to be. He remembered the morning he'd signed the divorce papers. He had taken Vanessa to brunch and ordered champagne. The waiter had smiled and said congratulations, and Nathan had felt the uncomplicated pleasure of a new chapter beginning. Elena had been sitting somewhere in Brooklyn, probably, with a drafting pad and a cup of coffee, and the particular quiet of a woman who had been released from something and was already building. He had not known that. He had not thought to wonder about it. He was wondering now, too late, in the amber light of the Meridian Grand, with the champagne going warm in his glass, and Gerald Fitch nowhere to be seen, and Vanessa sitting beside him with her hands folded and her face closed around something she hadn't finished deciding yet. The string quartet played on. Nathan sat in his chair, in his Brioni tuxedo, in the room full of people who mattered, and felt the specific and undeserved education of a man who had been wrong about the most important things and was only now, in public, beginning to understand how wrong. He did not get up from the table for a long time after the applause ended. The car ride home was quiet in the way that meant both of them were thinking things they hadn't organized into sentences yet. Vanessa sat on her side of the back seat with her clutch in her lap and her face turned toward the window, watching the city move past. Nathan sat on his side with his jacket unbuttoned and his hands loose on his knees, and neither of them spoke for the first 10 blocks, which was unusual. Vanessa was not someone who sat in silence comfortably. She filled space naturally, instinctively, the way some people did. A comment about the evening, a story, something observed on the street. The silence meant she was choosing it, which meant it was deliberate, which meant she was further into her thinking than he'd realized. The driver turned onto 6th Avenue, and the city opened up around them, late night and loud, still lit, and still moving at 11:30 on a Thursday. "I liked her," Vanessa said. Nathan turned. "I introduced myself," she said, "at the bar, earlier, when I went to get a drink." She was still looking out the window. "She was standing there for a minute while Blackwell was talking to someone, and I went over." Nathan stared at her. "You didn't tell me that." "I know." Vanessa shifted slightly in her seat. "I wasn't sure what to do with it." "What did you say to her?" Vanessa turned away from the window and looked at him. "I said my name. She said hers. I said I'd heard Blackwell's remarks and that the project sounded remarkable." She paused. "She said thank you. Then she asked what I did, and I told her, and she said something nice about it. Not fake nice, actually nice, and asked a question about the brand strategy side of things that was more specific than I expected." Another pause. "And then someone pulled her away, and that was it." Nathan tried to picture it. He found he couldn't. Quite. The specific image of Vanessa and Elena standing at the bar together, talking, was too strange to assemble cleanly. "She wasn't cold," Vanessa said. "She knew who I was. She had to know, and she wasn't cold." "No," Nathan said, "she wouldn't be." "That's—" Vanessa stopped, looked back out the window. "That's actually harder, somehow." He understood that. He did not say so. The car moved uptown, and Nathan watched the streets slide past and thought about Elena standing at a bar at the Meridian Grand, meeting the woman Nathan had left her for, and responding with genuine warmth. Not a performance, not a studied graciousness designed to humiliate by contrast, though it might have that effect. Just herself. The way she had always been when she was comfortable, when she felt no need to compete. He had not let her be comfortable very often. He was beginning to understand that. He did not sleep well. Vanessa stayed at his apartment, but they were both careful with each other in a way that felt different from before. The careful of two people who had learned something they hadn't asked to learn and were not sure yet what to do with it. She went to sleep before him, or seemed to, lying on her side with her back to the middle of the bed. Nathan lay on his back in the dark and ran the evening through his head. Not obsessively, he was too tired for obsession, but methodically. He was a capital markets professional. He had spent 15 years learning how to look at a set of facts, strip out the noise, and see what the structure actually was. The structure here was not complicated. He had been married to Elena Hart for 10 years. In those 10 years, she had been, by any honest measure, a better partner to him than he had been to her. She had managed the household in the ways that made his professional life function smoothly without ever being asked to. She had attended events she didn't enjoy because he wanted her there. She had revised her own ambitions around the rhythms of their shared life, not because he had demanded it, but because she had made space for him without being asked to, and he had occupied that space without acknowledging it. And while all of that was happening, she had been working. Not the small project hobbyist work he'd mentally filed her work as. Something serious. Something that had been serious for years and that he had simply declined to see as serious, because seriousness, in his personal taxonomy, looked like the things he did. Client meetings, revenue targets, advancement, the particular vocabulary of corporate ambition. Elena had been working in a different vocabulary, and he had never learned it, and so he had never read what she was writing. She was always building. You simply never saw it. He didn't know where that line came from. It was not something she'd said to him, not yet, but it arrived in his head with the weight of something inevitable, the kind of sentence that made you understand a long and complicated situation in a few words. And he lay there in the dark of his apartment and felt the truth of it sit on his chest until he finally, sometime after 2 a.m, fell into an uneven and unsatisfying sleep. The Monday meeting with Gerald Fitch was not what Nathan had expected. He had spent the weekend preparing for it with the specific dread of a man who knows the conversation is coming and cannot shorten the distance to it. He had run various versions in his head. Gerald asking pointed questions about the Elena situation, Nathan managing the narrative carefully, things ending badly but manageably. He had prepared answers. Gerald had a different agenda. He sat across from Nathan in his corner office on the 34th floor, with the particular stillness of a man who had slept on something and arrived at a decision, and he did not ask about Elena at all. Not directly. He talked about Blackwell Global Ventures. He talked about the 3 Westbridge clients who had overlapping interests with the Vanthorpe expansion project. He talked about the kind of relationships that a firm like theirs needed to develop over the next 2 years if they were going to move into the infrastructure financing space they'd been discussing for the last 18 months. Then he said, I need to know if there are any relationships in this landscape that are going to create complications for the firm. Nathan said, define complications. Gerald looked at him evenly. Personal history with principals or associated parties that would make a professional relationship uncomfortable, or that would make the other party unwilling to work with us. Nathan thought about Elena standing at the Meridian Grand, the way she had looked at him across the room, steady, unprepared in no visible way, uninterested in the drama that Nathan had half expected the moment to require. I don't believe it will be an issue, Nathan said. We ended things professionally. She has no reason to... He stopped. He was doing the thing again, shaping facts into a story that was technically accurate but incomplete. We're not in contact, he said instead. We haven't been in contact since the divorce. I have no reason to think she would object to a professional relationship with the firm. Gerald held his gaze for a moment. Good, he said. That's what I needed to hear. The meeting ended with 4 new items on Nathan's plate, all of them infrastructure adjacent, all of them requiring him to build relationships in a space that was now adjacent to Elena's space. He left Gerald's office with his jaw set and his calendar already filling up, and the distinct sense that his professional life and his personal miscalculations were now, definitively, in the same orbit. He stood at the elevator and pressed the button and thought, she didn't torpedo anything. She could have. She had enough standing in that room, on that evening, to say one sentence to the right person and change the shape of Gerald's Monday morning call list. She didn't. He wasn't sure if that made it better or worse. He saw. 3 weeks after the gala, Nathan ran into Claire, Elena's sister, the one who had called him 2 weeks after the move out and said, you have no idea what you just walked away from. He had thought of her as difficult at the time, which was the word he used for women who said direct things to him without softening them. He ran into her at a dry cleaner on the Upper West Side. Claire lived in the neighborhood. He knew that, had just not accounted for it. And the meeting had the particular quality of an encounter that neither party had prepared for, and both were too mature to avoid. Claire was 44, slightly younger than Elena, with the same dark eyes and a manner that was warmer than Elena's in social situations, but less patient under the surface. She saw Nathan before he saw her, which meant she had a second to decide how to handle it, and what she decided was to be normal, which Nathan appreciated even as it made him slightly uncomfortable. "Nathan," she said, neutral, a fact. "Claire." He held the door for her, which she accepted without comment. "How are you?" "Fine." She handed her ticket to the woman behind the counter. "You?" "Fine," he said. There was a beat, the kind of beat that in any honest conversation would be filled by, "So what was it like seeing Elena at the gala?" Claire obviously knew about the gala. The gala had been written about in 2 publications by the following week, and Elena's name had been in both, and Nathan's name had been in neither, which was its own answer to a question he hadn't known was being asked. The woman handed Claire her dry cleaning, a dark blazer and a plastic sleeve. "She's really good, you know," Claire said. She was addressing the blazer, folding it over her arm. "She was always really good, even when you two were—" She stopped, recalibrated. "I don't say that to—" "I know," Nathan said. Claire looked at him. Whatever she saw made her decide not to say the other things she had prepared, which was either mercy or disappointment. Nathan couldn't tell. "She's happy," Claire said. "Actually happy. I'm saying that because I think you deserve to know, not because I think it'll be easy to hear." Nathan nodded. "I'm glad," he said, and he meant it the way you meant things that also hurt. Claire took her blazer and left, and Nathan collected his own suit from the counter and stood on the sidewalk outside and breathed the cold November air, and thought about all the ways a person could be thoroughly informed about something they'd already done wrong and still have nowhere useful to put that information. He called Vanessa on a Tuesday night, 3.5 weeks after the gala. Not to end things, not deliberately, not with a plan. He called because she hadn't answered a text from 2 days earlier, and he was aware of the silence in a way that suggested something had changed. She answered on the 3rd ring. "Hey," she said. There was background noise. She was somewhere other than home, bar, maybe, or a restaurant. "Hey," Nathan said. "You didn't text back." "I know. I was figuring out what I wanted to say." A pause. "Can you hear me okay?" "Yeah." He heard her move somewhere quieter. A door, maybe. The background noise dropped. "I've been thinking," Vanessa said, "about the gala, about things." "Okay. I think we've been—" She stopped. "You know how sometimes you're in something and it's working in a certain kind of way, and you tell yourself it's good because it's working, but you haven't really asked yourself if it's actually good?" Nathan looked at the ceiling. "Yeah. I think that's been us, for a while." He did not argue with her. He thought about the brunch after the divorce papers, the champagne, the waiter's smile. He thought about the fitting room and the cufflinks. He thought about all the ways he had shaped Vanessa into a symbol of something he wanted, rather than looking at her as a person who had her own interior life that he'd been consistently about a half-inch short of actually engaging with. "You're not wrong," he said. "That's it?" Vanessa said, a flash of her old sharpness. "You're not going to—" "I'm not going to argue with you about it," Nathan said, "because you're right, and I think I've been not fair to you, in ways I didn't intend but also didn't look at hard enough." Silence on her end. "I liked her," Vanessa said again. The same words from the car, the same tone, but different now. She was saying something more complicated than the sentence. "She's real. She's the kind of person who's actually real. You know what I mean? Not a version of something." "I know what you mean," Nathan said. "I think you spent a long time—" She chose her words carefully, looking past real things for things that felt better in the short term. "I think I was one of those things." It was more honest than Nathan had expected and more honest than he deserved, and he sat with it for a moment before saying, I think you might be right about that, too. Vanessa laughed, once, without humor. You're the most agreeable you've ever been right now, and it's incredibly annoying. I know. Okay, she said. And then, I think I need to figure out what I'm doing with all of this. Okay, Nathan said. I'll talk to you, she said. Not a promise. A maybe. A door left partly open in a way that meant neither of them was sure it should stay that way. The call ended. Nathan put his phone face down on the counter and stood in his kitchen for a while. Gerald Fitch called him on a Wednesday. Not about infrastructure this time. Nathan knew it from the first 2 seconds of the call. The quality of Gerald's voice, the slight excess of casual in his opening. Gerald Fitch did not do casual. He performed it when he was about to say something he needed to arrive at sideways. The Hargrove Foundation Board had a call yesterday, Gerald said. Routine strategy review. Westbridge was in the picture for the year-end fundraising coordination. You know what I mean? The placement work on the endowment side, nothing formal yet, just in discussion. Right, Nathan said. He was at his desk. He put down his pen. Apparently some questions came up about the firm's team composition, specifically about who would be the face of the relationship for our side. Gerald paused. Mitchell Crane from the board apparently asked whether we had anyone on the team who had worked in the cultural sector or with mission-aligned investors. Mitchell Crane. Nathan pulled up the Hargrove Foundation board roster in his head. Third-generation family money, a known Blackwell global relationship going back 15 years. Anne? Nathan said. And I put your name forward, Gerald said, which I'm sure you understand is a significant gesture of confidence given what's at play here. I understand that. There was a pause on the call, Gerald said, after your name. Someone asked if you had existing relationships in the space. I said you had some. Another pause. There was another pause. Nathan looked at his pen on the desk. Someone new. I believe someone on the call was aware of your personal connection to Hart, Gerald said. I don't know who made whom aware. I don't know the mechanism. But there was a quality to the silence that I've learned to read. But Nathan's chest tightened. Is the relationship in jeopardy? Not yet, Gerald said. But Nathan, I need you to understand that we are building towards something with this client that is worth considerably more than your current contribution to the firm, and any association with personal drama around a central figure in the Vanthorpe project. It's not drama, Nathan said. It doesn't have to be drama to look like drama, Gerald said. People in that room don't know the details of your divorce. They know what they know, which is that you were married to the woman who designed the most significant cultural project this city has seen in 20 years, and you no longer are, and the relationship ended less than 18 months before she took that commission. His voice was measured, not unkind, but clear. That's a story. Whether it's accurate or not, it's a story. And stories in rooms like the one that Call was in, they have lives of their own. Nathan said nothing. I'm not asking you to do anything, Gerald said. I'm informing you, so you're not surprised later. I appreciate that. Handle yourself well, Gerald said. That's all I'm saying. The call ended. Nathan sat at his desk and felt the walls of his professional life doing something he did not have a good word for. Not collapsing, not yet, but shifting. The slow, settling movement of a structure that has discovered one of its foundational assumptions was wrong. He had spent 15 years building a career that he'd been proud of, and he had believed, not arrogantly or so he'd thought, but with the steady confidence of a man who had earned his position, that the career was solid, that it was his, that it rested on what he'd done. He was starting to see how much of it had rested on who he'd been standing next to, on the reflected credibility of a marriage to a woman the world had not yet recognized but was now, rapidly, recognizing all at once. He had not known that. He was not sure it would have changed his choices if he had. That was perhaps the most honest thought he'd had in months, and it arrived like something through glass, muffled but unmistakable. Badin. The article ran on a Friday. It was in an architecture and design magazine that Nathan had no reason to read, and that therefore found him through a forwarded email from a colleague who had no idea what he was forwarding. Just a note that said impressive stuff. Isn't this your ex? with the link pasted below. Nathan opened it at his kitchen table on a Saturday morning. The headline was precise and unsentimental: Heart Design Studio and the Architecture of Attention, How One Designer's Vision is Redefining Cultural Space. The magazine was not tabloid. It was the kind of publication that assigned 12,000-word pieces to subjects it considered genuinely important. He read the whole thing. It took him 40 minutes. He read it the way he had not read anything in years, slowly, without skimming, going back to reread sentences that gave him pause. He read about Elena's design philosophy, the temporal flow framework that Patricia Sohn had summarized at the Gala, which the article unpacked in detail that was simultaneously technical and completely accessible. He read about her approach to the Van Thorpe Commission, the 18-month process by which she had arrived at a solution that the Foundation Selection Committee had described, on record, as the only proposal they received that solved a problem they hadn't known to articulate. He read about her path to that moment, described in Elena's own words, quoted at length, speaking in the direct and unliterary way she had always spoken when she was talking about something real. She had not talked to journalists while they were married. She had not sought attention. She had attended events at Nathan's request and had been invisible at them, or nearly invisible, in the way of someone who was present in body and elsewhere in mind, doing whatever she did when no one was asking her to perform. She had been working. He had known this intellectually for weeks now, since the Gala, since Gerald's first sideways comment, since Patricia Sohn at the table in the Meridian Grand. But knowing intellectually was different from reading it in 12,000 words of careful, well-reported prose. Reading it was different because it had a chronology. It showed him the timeline. The Community Arts Center in Queens, the residential renovation in Park Slope that had been written up in a local design blog he'd never read, the mixed-use building on the Long Island City waterfront that she'd been consulting on, the site visit she'd come home from, the afternoon she'd said, "I figured something out about the facade treatment," and he had said, "Can you give me 10 minutes?" That building had been completed 2 years ago. It had won an award from a regional architecture organization that Nathan had never heard of. The award ceremony had apparently been on a Thursday evening, and Elena had gone alone, and she had not mentioned it when she came home. He was sitting in his kitchen in the building they had shared. He had kept the apartment after the divorce. Elena had not pushed for it, had seemed almost relieved not to have it. And he was at the same kitchen table where she had sat for a decade with her drafting pads and her coffee and her sketchbooks, in the chair where she had said okay when he had asked her for the divorce. The article ended with a quote from Elena about what the Van Thorpe project meant to her. The journalist had apparently asked her to describe the moment she knew she'd found the right design. Elena had said, "I'd been working on the problem for about 4 months, and I kept approaching it as a space problem, and the solution kept being wrong in ways I couldn't fully diagnose. And then one morning I woke up, and I thought, it's not a space problem, it's a time problem. It's about how a person's experience changes from hour 1 to hour 4. Once I saw that, everything else organized itself around it." The journalist had asked when that morning was. Elena had given a date. Nathan counted backward from that date on his fingers, sitting at the kitchen table. It was 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized. She had been working. She had always been working. She had been working while he was ordering champagne at brunch and choosing cufflinks and rehearsing his answers for the kind of rooms he'd wanted to be in. He closed his laptop. He sat for a long time at the kitchen table with his hands folded on top of it and looked at the window and the November sky beyond it and felt something he had been avoiding feeling since the evening at the Meridian Grand. Not guilt, exactly. Not the clean, manageable kind that comes with a clear trespass and a clear remedy. Something more distributed. The slow, particular grief of a man who understood that he had spent a significant portion of his life failing to recognize the most valuable thing in it, and that the failing had been consistent and ordinary and without drama, which was somehow worse than if it had been dramatic. He had not been a villain in Elena's story. He had been something more difficult than a villain. He had been someone who didn't pay attention, who looked at her for 10 years and processed her as background, who had stood in rooms with her and never once thought, "I wonder what she's working on," with the actual intention of listening to the answer. She had not needed him to be her champion. He understood that now. She had needed, not much actually, that was the thing. She had needed someone to look at what she was doing and take it seriously. Not praise, not promotion, just the basic recognition that what she was building was real. He had not given her that. She had built it anyway. Who's she? Nathan did not contact Elena. Not that week. Not the following week. He thought about it. Not in a strategic way, not with the calculation of a man trying to reopen a door, but with the plain wondering of someone trying to understand what he would even say, and whether there was anything to say that would be honest, and also not simply about his own need to have said it. He could not find that sentence. Every version he drafted in his head came out as something he was doing for himself, an absolution he was asking her to provide, a witness he was appointing her to be for his understanding of what had gone wrong. And she had not signed up for that job. She had left that job the same way she had left the apartment, thoroughly and without drama, with the purposeful clarity of someone who had decided to go and was going. He was not entitled to her time. He was not entitled to her forgiveness. He was not entitled to anything from her except the basic indifference she had already given him at the gala. The glance held for a moment and released. He kept the apartment. He kept going to work. He had the Monday conversations with Gerald and the infrastructure relationship building and the professional recalibration of a man whose firm was now, carefully, repositioning itself in a space that Elena's work had helped to open. He told himself this was fine, that it was manageable, that he was managing, and mostly he was. He was a functional and capable man, Nathan Caldwell, and he had the deep practical competence of someone who had built things and maintained things and kept going through difficulty, and he applied all of that to the business of continuing. But some mornings he sat at the kitchen table and looked at the chair where Elena had sat and thought about the sketchbooks. The ones he'd returned to her building without opening, the others he couldn't account for. And he felt the particular weight of things that were gone and could not be retrieved, and he held that weight for a few minutes before standing up and going to work. That was what it cost, in the ordinary daily arithmetic of a life where you had been exactly this particular kind of wrong. Not everything at once, just this, every morning, for a while. December came in cold and gray, the way New York Decembers did when they weren't trying to be picturesque, just flat sky and wind off the river, and the particular grim efficiency of a city that had stopped performing for tourists and was now simply getting through the season. Nathan got through the season. He worked. He took the infrastructure meetings Gerald had assigned him, and he was good in them, because he was good at his job when he focused, and focusing was the one tool he had left that was fully intact. He built the relationships Gerald wanted built. He sent the right emails and attended the right lunches and said the right things to the right people, and nobody looking at him from the outside would have seen anything other than a competent mid-career professional doing his job with reasonable success. On the inside, something had shifted in a way that hadn't shifted back. It wasn't depression. He knew depression, had watched his father move through a version of it for 3 years in Nathan's early 20s, and this was not that. It was more like the feeling of a room after furniture has been removed. The dimensions were the same. The light came in the same windows, but the space had been reconfigured in a way that changed how you moved through it, and you kept reaching for things that weren't where they used to be. Vanessa was not where she used to be. They had not officially ended things in the phone call in November, but they hadn't continued them either. There had been 2 brief texts in December, one from her, one from him, both civil, both approximate, and then silence that settled like a decision neither of them had formally made, but both had accepted. Nathan did not grieve it the way he'd expected to. He felt its absence, but not as loss, more as clarification, as the room getting a little more honest about what it actually contained. He had dinner with a colleague from the firm the week before Christmas, a man named Drew Ashford, who had been at Westbridge about the same length of time as Nathan, and who had the quality of a person who was good company without requiring much. They ate at a steakhouse on 49th Street and talked about the firm and sports, and a mutual acquaintance who had just taken a new position in London, and toward the end of the second bottle of wine, Drew said, without particular weight, "You seem different lately." "Different how?" Nathan said. Drew considered it. "Quieter. Not bad quiet. Just like you've been thinking." "I have been thinking," Nathan said. "About what?" Nathan looked at his wine. "About whether I've been paying attention to the right things." Drew looked at him across the table with the patient expression of a man who has had a few of these conversations in his life and knows not to rush them. "That's a big one," Drew said. "Yeah," Nathan said. "You come up with an answer?" "Working on it," Nathan said. Drew nodded and refilled his glass and let it be, which was exactly the right thing to do, and Nathan felt a simple gratitude for that, for the company of someone who could sit with an unfinished thing without trying to fix it. The professional situation clarified itself in January, and not in Nathan's favor. The Hargrove Foundation's year-end placement work, the endowment project Gerald had mentioned, the one worth more than Nathan's current annual contribution to the firm, went to a different Westbridge team. Nathan was told it was a matter of relationship fit and timeline, which was the explanation given when the actual explanation was something that couldn't be said directly. Gerald called him into the office in the second week of January and delivered the news with the careful candor of a man who had prepared his sentences. "I want to be straight with you," Gerald said. "You're a valuable member of this team. This isn't a performance issue." "Then what is it?" Nathan said. Gerald looked at him levelly. "The Hargrove relationship is now deeply connected to the Vanthorpe project, and by extension to Blackwell Global. That's the direction it moved in, and it moved there faster than I anticipated. Given the visibility of certain circumstances," he stopped, started again. "I don't think your personal history with Elena Hart is disqualifying in principle, but I think it's complicating, and in a relationship this significant, with this level of visibility, I'm not willing to introduce complications I can manage around." Nathan sat with that. "You're sidelining me." "I'm reassigning you to a track that doesn't have that complication," Gerald said. "It's not the same thing." "It's the same thing, Gerald." Gerald did not argue. He had the decency not to argue. "What track?" Nathan said. Gerald outlined it. It was a lateral move, technically. It was a move that any outside observer would describe as a reasonable reallocation of resources. It was also, clearly, a step back from the direction Nathan had been building toward. The infrastructure and cultural sector work, the clients that mattered most at this point in the firm's strategy, the relationships that would have advanced him in ways the new track would not. He had been moving toward something for 15 years. He was now moving sideways. "I understand," Nathan said, because there was nothing useful to say other than that. He went back to his desk and stared at his computer and felt the specific humiliation of a professional consequence that he had brought on himself. Not through incompetence, not through dishonesty, but through a set of personal decisions made years ago that were now extracting their costs through channels he hadn't foreseen. He had left Elena. Elena had built something extraordinary. The world he'd been climbing toward was now organized, in part, around what she had built, and his presence in that world was complicated by his departure from her. The irony was not lost on him. It sat in his chest like a stone that was shaped exactly wrong. He called his mother that evening. He did this rarely. His mother, Diane, was 72 and lived in suburban Connecticut, and was a person Nathan loved in the complicated way of an adult child who understood their parent better than they did as a child, and was not entirely sure the understanding had improved things. She was sharp, practical, not given to sentimentality. She had liked Elena. She had not said much about the divorce. She had said enough. She answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been near her phone. "Nathan." Her voice was the same as it always was. Present. Even. "Hey, Mom." "This is a Thursday call," she said. "You don't usually call on Thursdays." "I know." "Are you all right?" "Yeah," he said. "More or less." There was a pause. He could hear the television in the background at her house, some evening news program, which she muted. "I heard about the Gala," she said. He was briefly surprised, then wasn't. Claire and his mother had stayed in touch after the divorce. Elena had not asked her to. Claire had simply continued calling Diane because she liked her, which said something about the quality of the relationship Nathan had dissolved. "Claire told you," he said. "She sent me the article," Diane said. "The magazine piece. I read it." Another pause. "Elena always was extraordinary." "I know," Nathan said. "Do you?" His mother's voice was not harsh, just direct, in the way it had always been, because you had a funny way of showing it. "Mom, I'm not saying it to start a fight," she said. "I'm saying it because you called me on a Thursday, and that means you're trying to work something out, and I'm not going to pretend I don't know what it is." He heard her shift in her chair. "What are you trying to work out?" Nathan leaned back against the kitchen counter. Through the window, the city was dark and gridded and still going, as it always was. I don't know how to fix it, he said, and I'm not even sure what fixing would mean, but I feel like I should. He stopped. I feel like I owe her something, an acknowledgement, at least, and I can't figure out if that's for her or for me. His mother was quiet for a moment. Probably both, she said. That's usually how it is. Is it worth doing if part of it is selfish? Nathan. Her voice was patient in the way of someone who had answered some version of this question many times. Almost everything is part selfish. The question is whether the other parts are real. A pause. Are you sorry? Yes, he said, without hesitation. I am. Then say so, she said. If you can find a way to say it that doesn't make it about you needing something from her in return, that's the only version worth doing. He thought about that for a long time after they hung up. January turned into February. The Van Thorpe groundbreaking ceremony was scheduled for March, and the city's cultural press was building toward it with the particular anticipatory energy that attached to events that had been pre-identified as significant. Nathan saw Elena's name in 3 separate publications in a 2-week span, 2 architecture journals, and a piece in a general interest magazine about women who had rebuilt their professional trajectories after major personal transitions. He read that one with an attention that felt close to something he couldn't name. The piece was not about the divorce. Elena had not spoken about the divorce, not in any of the coverage Nathan had read, not in any detail. She had referred once to a period of personal transition that clarified what I wanted to build. And the journalist had let it sit as the diplomatic shorthand it was, and moved on. Elena had not made Nathan a character in her story. He was not the obstacle overcome. He was not the villain. He was, in the version she told publicly, barely there. He was not sure whether to be grateful for that or to find it, in some precise and hard-to-justify way, worse. He was at his kitchen table again when he read that piece. He had a habit now of sitting at the table in the mornings before work, just for a few minutes, in the chair where he'd always sat, looking at the chair across from him. It was not a healthy habit, and it was not a destructive one. It was just a habit of attention. The discipline of sitting with what he'd done or failed to do without immediately converting the feeling into action. He had started the divorce, in his head, as the beginning of a better chapter. He was understanding now that it had been an ending, of something real that he'd undervalued until it was gone. That didn't mean the marriage should have continued. He knew that clearly. He and Elena had stopped working years before the affair, and the affair had been the form the stopping had taken when it finally demanded a form. He did not believe in staying in things out of obligation or inertia, and he did not think Elena would have wanted that from him. But there was a difference between right and good. The divorce had been right. His conduct within the marriage had not been good, and those were 2 different things, and he had been conflating them for the better part of a year. He wrote the letter in February, not because he had landed on the perfect version, he never did, but because his mother's question had stayed with him, and the honest answer to "Are you sorry?" had been too immediate and too clean to ignore. And he had decided, finally, that saying the thing was better than not saying it, provided he said it the right way. He wrote it by hand on paper, which he hadn't done in years. He wrote it 3 times. The first version was too long and too self-focused. Too much explanation, too much accounting of his own internal process, which was not what Elena needed and not what he was owed the chance to deliver. The second version was too short, so stripped of everything personal that it read like a legal communication rather than a human one. The third version was somewhere between. He wrote, "Elena, I'm not writing this expecting anything from you. Not a response, not forgiveness, not a conversation. I'm writing it because I've been thinking for the last several months about the ways I failed to see what you were building while we were together, and I think you deserve to hear me say clearly that I'm sorry for that. Not for the divorce. I think the divorce was probably the right thing for both of us. I'm sorry for the 10 years before it, in which you were working on something extraordinary, and I treated it as secondary to things that mattered less." I read the article. I've read several of the pieces. I don't say that to take credit for paying attention now. I say it because I want you to know that I understand finally what I was looking at all those years and didn't see. You were always building. I simply never saw it. That's on me, and I carry it, and I wanted you to know that I do. I hope the work continues to be everything you wanted it to be. From what I can see, it will. Nathan. He addressed the envelope to her studio. The address was on the Heart Design Studio website, which had launched 6 months ago with a clean, minimal aesthetic that looked exactly like Elena's taste in everything. And he mailed it on a Wednesday morning in the second week of February, and then he went to work and tried not to think about it. He did think about it, of course, for days. The specific anxiety of having said something true and honest and having no control over how it landed, whether it would land at all, whether she would read it and file it away, whether she would find it presumptuous or self-serving despite his efforts not to be either. He heard nothing for 2 weeks. He had not expected to hear anything. He had told himself when he sealed the envelope that he had no expectation of a response, and that the act of sending it was complete in itself. He had largely believed that when he said it, but there was a part of him that had listened, in a low and mostly honest way, for the sound of the mailbox. He was not immune to hoping. The response arrived on a Friday. A plain white envelope with his address and handwriting he recognized immediately. Elena had always had distinctive handwriting, architectural and precise, the letters constructed rather than scrawled. He opened it standing in the building lobby. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper and nothing else. No letter, no words, just a photograph. A printed image, small and slightly grainy, of the interior of a building he did not immediately recognize. Wide, light-filled, with something happening with the ceiling that was hard to categorize. Not beautiful in an obvious way. Interesting. The kind of space that made you want to understand how it worked. On the back, in Elena's handwriting, 2 words. Thank you. That was all. Nathan stood in the lobby of his building with the photograph in his hands for a long moment. He turned it over twice. He looked at the ceiling in the image again, the way the light came in, the way the space organized itself around it, and he thought, temporal flow. She thinks about time. He folded the photograph carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. He did not try to respond. He did not write back to elaborate on what he'd said or to open a dialogue he hadn't been invited into. He had said what needed saying. She had received it. That was the transaction, and it was complete. And trying to extend it would have been exactly the kind of self-interested move he was trying to stop making. He took the elevator upstairs and went about his Friday. Spring came. The groundbreaking ceremony for the Van Thorpe Museum expansion was held on a bright cold morning in mid-March on the museum's east lawn, with a crowd of about 200 people that included city officials, foundation board members, architects, journalists, and various figures from the cultural and financial worlds of New York. Nathan was not there. He watched the coverage online on a Saturday morning with coffee at the kitchen table. There were photographs from 3 publications, video from a local news segment, a brief clip, 40 seconds, of Elena speaking at the podium, dressed simply, her hair back, squinting slightly into the March sun, saying something about what it meant to build for the long future, for the people who would experience the space decades from now, for the question of what we leave behind. The clip was too short to hear all of it, but he watched it twice. She looked well. She looked entirely herself, the self that had been there all along and that the world was now, belatedly, getting acquainted with. She looked like someone who had arrived where she intended. He closed the laptop and sat with his coffee and looked out the window at the spring sky and felt something that was not happiness, exactly, but that was adjacent to it. The particular feeling of watching something you care about, even imperfectly and from a distance, arrive at what it deserves. He had lost the right to call it his. He understood that. He had forfeited that particular form of ownership through the daily small failures of a decade, and the world was not going to give it back to him, and he was not going to ask. But he could watch from here. He could acknowledge it clearly, honestly, to himself, without making it about what it meant for him. He could hold the knowledge that she was extraordinary, that she had always been extraordinary, that he had known it somewhere underneath everything and chosen not to pay it the attention it deserved, and sit with that knowledge without trying to convert it into something useful. It was not a comfortable feeling. It was not supposed to be. In late March, Nathan had lunch with a woman named Sasha Demir. He had met her through a mutual contact. She was a financial analyst at a different firm, 30-ish, whip-smart, with a sense of humor that surfaced at unexpected moments and then disappeared just as quickly. The lunch was professional, theoretically, a conversation about a shared client, But it ran over by 40 minutes and ended with both of them standing on the sidewalk outside the restaurant talking about a documentary they'd both seen recently, and she said, "You want to grab coffee sometime?" And he said yes, and they both understood that was not about coffee. He did not tell himself she was exactly what he'd been missing. He was not capable of telling himself that anymore. He told himself she seemed like someone he might genuinely want to know. That was different. That was better. He was not sure yet if he was capable of doing it differently, paying attention in the way that mattered, asking the questions and actually listening to the answers. But he was, at minimum, aware that it was a requirement rather than an optional feature. That was what these months had cost him, and that was what they had given him. The clarity of someone who had been educated by consequences rather than by choice, late, clumsy, not something to be proud of, but present, finally. Finally present. He walked back to the office in the March wind with his hands in his jacket pockets, and the photograph Elena had sent him was still there, in the inside pocket where he had put it on the February Friday and had not moved it since. He was not holding it. He was not taking it out to look at it. He was just aware of it, the way you were aware of things that mattered. Not constantly, not obtrusively, but as a weight you decided to carry, as a reminder, as the specific and instructive cost of having been a man who looked at the most valuable thing in his life and called it background. He would carry it. Not because it helped her. It didn't. She was fine without it. She was building something that would outlast both of them, in a city that was just beginning to understand what she could do. He would carry it because it was true, and because true things, even the costly ones, were better than the alternative. The wind came off the East River and hit him at the corner of 48th and Lex, and he turned his collar up and kept walking, and the city moved around him the way it always did. Indifferent, enormous, full of people building things he would never see. Gerald Fitch called him in late March about a new account. It was a genuine opportunity, not the infrastructure tier he'd lost, but something with its own solid floor. A pension management firm with cultural sector clients, newer money, the kind of relationship that could build slowly into something real. "It's yours if you want it," Gerald said. "I want it," Nathan said. "Good." A pause. "I know this year has been—" "I'm fine, Gerald." "I know you are," Gerald said. "I just wanted to say, you've handled yourself well, in a situation that was yours to make a mess of, and you didn't." Nathan thought about the letter, about the phone call with Vanessa, about the Saturday morning with the coffee and the groundbreaking video and the spring sky, about all the small and glamorous acts of a man trying to become slightly better than he had been without asking anyone to applaud him for it. "Thanks," he said. He said it without sarcasm and without false modesty. He meant it as one word that covered a lot of ground. It was enough. The new account Gerald had handed him turned out to be more work than Nathan had anticipated, which was fine. He needed the work the way certain people needed cold water in the morning. Not pleasant exactly, but clarifying. Something that required his full attention and gave his mind somewhere useful to be. The pension firm was called Ardmore Group, and its cultural sector clients were a mix of mid-size arts organizations and two regional museum foundations that were, Nathan discovered in the second week of working the account, both loosely connected to the same universe of donors and board members that orbited the Hargrove Foundation and by extension the Van Thorpe Project. New York was a large city that ran, at its operative levels, like a small town. He had known this. He felt it more concretely now. He was careful, not in the anxious, defensive way of a man trying to avoid a landmine, but in the deliberate way of someone who understood that carefulness was now a requirement he'd earned. He disclosed the prior relationship to Ardmore's managing partner in their second meeting, plainly, without drama, just as relevant context for the landscape. And the managing partner, a woman named Harriet Voss, who had been in this industry for 30 years and had heard considerably more complicated disclosures in her time, had nodded and said, "Good to know," and moved on. That was it. No drama. The thing Nathan had been braced for, the professional consequence that would detonate suddenly and completely, had not detonated. It had distributed itself instead through the smaller, less cinematic costs he'd already absorbed. The lateral move, the lost placement, the recalibrated reputation. These were real. They had happened. And now they were behind him, in the sense that consequences move behind you once they've finished arriving. He was building again. Something smaller than before, in some ways, but the foundation was more honest. He had 3 dates with Sasha Demir in April, 2 dinners and 1 afternoon at a museum. Her suggestion, which he found he didn't mind, which was itself new information about himself. She was nothing like Vanessa, which he had known from the beginning, but which clarified as he spent more time with her. Where Vanessa's intelligence was social, quick, adaptive, oriented toward reading rooms and people in motion, Sasha's was structural. She thought in systems. She would stop mid-conversation to say, "Wait, I'm not being precise," and then rephrase what she'd said with a care for accuracy that Nathan found, unexpectedly, attractive. She asked him about the divorce on their second dinner. Not intrusively. She was not a person who intruded. She asked it the way she asked most things, as a genuine question she was interested in the honest answer to. And she made clear by her manner that there was no wrong answer. "We grew in different directions," Nathan said, which was the sentence he'd been using since the divorce. Then he stopped. "Actually, that's not quite right." Sasha tilted her head slightly, waiting. "She grew," Nathan said. "I grew too, in my way, but I grew in a direction that made it harder for me to see what she was doing. And I didn't notice that was happening until it was well past the point where noticing would have helped." Sasha looked at him. "That's more honest than most people are about their divorces." "I've had a few months to practice," he said. "Is she okay?" The question surprised him, not because it was intrusive, but because it was the right question. The one that oriented toward Elena's reality rather than Nathan's feelings about his reality. And most people, when they asked about his divorce, oriented toward the second thing without thinking. "She's more than okay," Nathan said. "She's building something significant, a career that deserved to happen a long time ago." Sasha nodded. She didn't press further, which was the right instinct. He liked her for it. He liked that she had asked about Elena first. He had spent too long in his life surrounded by people who took their relational cues from him, who mirrored back whatever frame he offered, who made him feel right rather than making him think. Sasha did not do that. She was her own structure, and she was interested in the world as it was rather than as it was convenient to see it, and Nathan found in that quality something he needed that he didn't have a fully articulate name for. He was trying to pay attention. He was not always succeeding, but he was trying in a way he had not tried before, which was worth something even if it wasn't worth as much as he sometimes wanted it to be. The letter arrived in early May. Not a letter from Elena. That chapter had closed with its 2 words and the photograph, and Nathan had not expected it to reopen, and it didn't. What arrived in early May was a package, medium-sized padded envelope, his name and address in handwriting he didn't recognize at first, and then did. Claire's handwriting, angular and slightly impatient, the handwriting of a woman who wrote faster than she thought. He stood in the lobby and turned the package over. No note on the outside. He brought it upstairs and opened it at the kitchen table. Inside was a sketchbook, one of Elena's sketchbooks. The cover was dark green, worn at the corners, the spine slightly cracked from use. His name was not written anywhere on it. There was no accompanying note. Just the sketchbook packed in the envelope with a sheet of bubble wrap, as if it were something fragile. He opened it slowly. The first page had a date in the top corner, 9 years ago, the year after their first anniversary. The drawings began immediately, without preamble, a series of structural sketches, building facades, spatial diagrams that were dense with annotation in Elena's precise handwriting. He did not have the technical vocabulary to read everything she'd written, but he could see the thinking, the iterations, a concept pursued across 4 pages, revised, abandoned, picked up again 2 pages later with a new approach. The work of a mind that did not give up on problems, that moved around them and through them. He turned pages slowly. The sketchbook covered roughly 2 years of work. He recognized some of the references. The art center in Queens she'd mentioned once, the Long Island City project, something that looked like the early stages of a proposal for a building he didn't know. There were pages of pure structural thinking, column loads and sightline diagrams, things he couldn't follow. And there were pages that were less technical, sketches of spaces she'd been in, museums and lobbies and public plazas, with notes about what worked and what didn't, what a body felt moving through them, how light changed the experience of volume. On one page, near the middle, there was a sketch that stopped him. It was the kitchen. Their kitchen. He recognized the window, the particular angle of the table, the way the overhead light sat. She had sketched it from the chair where she always sat, looking toward the window, and she had done it in detail. Not as a technical exercise, but as a genuine act of looking. The objects on the counter, the shadow the cabinet threw, the way the morning light came in and hit the edge of the table at a particular angle. Underneath the sketch, in her handwriting, light changes everything. You have to be in it to know it. He sat with that page for a long time. She had been sitting at that table, in that chair, on some ordinary morning, and she had looked at the room around her and seen it as something worth drawing. Not because it was beautiful in any exceptional way, it was a perfectly ordinary Manhattan kitchen, but because she was someone who looked at things, who paid attention to the quality of light and what it did to ordinary surfaces in ordinary hours. He had been in that kitchen with her thousands of times, and he had never looked at it the way she had drawn it. He turned to the last page. It was blank except for a single line, written in pen, recently. The ink looked newer than the pencil drawings, a different quality of mark. I was always building. You simply never saw it. He read it twice. He closed the sketchbook and set it on the table and pressed his hand flat against the cover for a moment. It was not an accusation. He understood that immediately. It was not written in the voice of someone seeking to wound. It was written in the voice of someone who had decided to complete a sentence clearly and permanently because leaving it incomplete was its own unfinished business. It was an ending. The kind you wrote so that you didn't have to carry the unwritten version any longer. She was not doing this for him. She was doing this for herself. And she had chosen to send it anyway, through Claire, with no note, no request for response, because she was generous enough, or perhaps simply secure enough in her own wholeness, to let him have the ending too. Nathan sat at the kitchen table with the sketchbook under his hand and felt the full weight of it. Not crushing, not dramatic, but specific and honest. The weight of what had been there all along and what he had walked past, year after year, on his way to other things. He did not cry. He was not a man who cried easily, and he was past the point where crying would have been the right response anyway. He just sat. He let himself be in the room with it, the way she had always been in rooms, fully, without rushing toward the next thing. After a while, he stood up and made coffee and took the sketchbook with him to the window and stood there looking out at the city in the early May light. He called Claire that afternoon. She picked up on the second ring, and he could tell from the half-second pause after she said his name that she had been expecting the call. "I got it," he said. "I know." A pause. "She asked me to send it a couple weeks ago, said she'd been holding on to it, and she was done holding on to it." "Did she say anything else?" Claire was quiet for a moment. He could hear her thinking, the specific quality of a pause that was not evasion, but consideration. "She said she wasn't angry anymore," Claire said, "that it had taken a while and she'd done a lot of work to get there, and she was there." Another pause. "She said she didn't want the sketchbook in her apartment anymore because it belonged to a version of her life that was over, and she didn't want to throw it away because it was still her work. And she thought—" Claire stopped. "What?" Nathan said. "She thought you should have it," Claire said. "Not because you deserved it." Her words, not mine. She wasn't being mean, just precise. She said, "Not because you deserved it, but because having it might do something useful for you." A pause. "That's very her, you know." "I know," Nathan said. "She's not sitting around thinking about you, Nathan," Claire said. And again, not cruelly, just the directness of a woman who loved her sister and was not interested in managing Nathan's feelings at the expense of the truth. "I want to say that clearly. She's busy. She's happy. She's building something that's going to be around long after. She's just happy. That's the whole sentence." "I know," he said again. I'm not looking for anything from her, Claire. I just wanted you to know I received it." "Okay," Claire said. She softened slightly. "How are you doing?" "Better," Nathan said. "Honestly, better." "Good," she said, and she meant it. He could hear that she meant it, that despite everything she did not wish him badly, which was more than he'd earned and which he received with the quiet gratitude it deserved. They said goodbye. He stood at the window for a while longer and watched the city and thought about what better meant exactly. in the particular vocabulary of a man who had lost things he should have valued and was trying to understand what that knowledge was actually worth. Yes. May turned into June, and the Vanthorpe Museum expansion entered its first phase of construction. The coverage continued. Occasional pieces, mostly in architecture and design publications, sometimes in the broader press. Nathan read some of them and skipped others. He was trying to reach a relationship with Elena's public story that was honest without being morbid, one where he could acknowledge what she was building without making her building into something he was watching as a form of penance. He was not always successful at that. Some mornings were harder than others. Some pieces he read with the clean appreciation of someone who understood what the work was worth, and some he read with the specific ache of a man looking at the outline of something he'd had and released without understanding what he was releasing. Both were true. He stopped trying to have only one of them. The sketchbook stayed on his kitchen table for 2 weeks. He went back to it 3 times, not obsessively, but with the intentional attention of someone using an object to think with. He looked at the drawings and thought about what it meant to work in the way Elena worked. With patience, with iteration, with the willingness to pursue a problem through its resistance rather than around them. He thought about the ways his own career had taken the shortcuts that ambition made available. The shortcuts were real. He had not invented them, and they had not been without value. But there was something in the sketchbook that named what the shortcuts cost, which was a certain depth of engagement, a certain willingness to stay in the difficult part of the problem, rather than finding the more navigable surface. He was 43. He was not going to become a different person. He knew that. People who told themselves they were going to become fundamentally different people were usually setting themselves up to be disappointed. But you could adjust. You could learn to value slightly different things than you had, to pay attention to slightly different qualities, to be marginally more present in the rooms you were actually in. It was not a transformation. It was a recalibration. It was the smaller, realer version of the larger story he might have told about himself. He moved the sketchbook to his bookshelf in the 3rd week of June. Not away, still visible, still somewhere he could reach it, but off the table, out of the daily center. He was not done with what it had to teach him, but it was time to stop sitting at the table staring at it and time to start doing something with what he'd learned. Sasha met him at a gallery opening in Soho on a Friday night in late June. It was not a glamorous event. A mid-sized gallery, maybe 60 people, wine in plastic cups, the work of a sculptor Nathan didn't know. Sasha knew the sculptor tangentially, through a friend, and had mentioned it 2 weeks earlier with the casual certainty of someone who went to gallery openings because she was actually interested in art, rather than because she was interested in being seen at art. Nathan had said he'd come, and he had come, and he was standing in front of a piece, a suspended arrangement of metal forms, irregular and slightly unbalanced, that cast complicated shadows on the wall behind it, when Sasha appeared beside him with 2 cups of wine and handed him one. "What do you think?" she said. He looked at the piece. He thought about what Elena had taught him, without intending to, about looking at things, about asking what problem something was trying to solve before you decided whether it was solving it. "I think it's trying to do something with weight," he said. "The way it hangs. It looks like it should fall, but it doesn't. I think that's intentional." Sasha looked at the piece. "I think you're right," she said. She sounded mildly surprised. "What?" he said. "Nothing. I just didn't expect you to see that on the first look." "I've been paying more attention to things," Nathan said. Sasha glanced at him. There was something in her expression, assessing, warm, not entirely credulous, that he liked. She did not take things at face value, which meant that when she did decide to believe something about him, it would mean something. "Good," she said. "It's a good habit." They moved through the gallery together, and he asked her questions about the work, not performatively, but with the genuine interest of someone practicing a new way of looking, and she answered with the directness she always had, and corrected him twice when he was wrong, and did not soften either correction, which was fine. He was not building a story about what this was. He was trying to resist the architecture of conclusion, the human instinct to look at a new situation and immediately construct a meaning for it, a trajectory, a destination. He had done that with Vanessa, and it had produced a relationship that was mostly made of projection. He did not want to do that again. He wanted to pay attention to what was actually there, to let it be what it was for as long as it needed to be what it was, to ask questions and listen to the answers and adjust accordingly, the way you did when you were actually present rather than running slightly ahead of the moment you were in. He was not good at this yet. He was aware of that. But he was trying with more deliberateness than he had before, and he was managing to catch himself when he slipped, which was a kind of progress even when it didn't feel like much. Outside the gallery afterward, waiting for their cars, Sasha said, "I like how you're different than I thought you'd be." "How did you think I'd be?" She tilted her head slightly. "More polished. You have this surface thing. The suit, the manner, the way you work a room without looking like you're working it. I thought that was most of it." A pause. "It's not most of it." "What's the rest of it?" he said. She looked at him in the way she had, appraising, direct. "Someone trying to figure something out," she said. "Who knows they haven't figured it out yet?" He held that for a moment. "Is that good?" "It's real," she said. "Real is better than good." He thought about the kitchen sketch in Elena's sketchbook. Light changes everything. You have to be in it to know it. "Yeah," he said. "I'm starting to think so." The truth of the thing, the whole shape of it, the way it looked from a sufficient distance, was something Nathan arrived at gradually, over the months that followed, in the way you arrived at understandings that were too large to receive all at once, and had to be approached from multiple directions before they revealed themselves fully. He had loved Elena. He was clear about that, the way he had always been clear about it. He had loved her the way a person loved someone they had been with for 10 years, with the depth of shared ordinary time, the texture of a life conducted together. But love was not the same as attention, and he had confused them, had believed on some largely unexamined level that the love proved the attention, that because he felt something when he looked at her, he must have been seeing her. He had not been seeing her. She had been there, fully herself, building something extraordinary on the kitchen table and in the studio she rented in Brooklyn, and in the site visits she came home from with that electric energy he hadn't known how to receive. And he had been in the same rooms and had looked and had not seen, because seeing required a kind of active, interested looking that he had not been giving her. This was not, he understood now, the story of a man who had failed to love. It was the story of a man who had loved without paying attention, and those two failures produced different kinds of damage. One was the damage of cruelty. The other was the damage of indifference dressed as presence, which was, in some ways, harder to name and harder to recover from, because it didn't look like a wound and it didn't feel like one, until one day the accumulation of not being seen became too heavy to carry without noticing. Elena had carried it. She had carried it for years with the particular grace of a woman who had decided that her work was going to happen regardless of whether anyone in her immediate life was watching. She had not made him responsible for her vision. She had not asked him to be its champion. She had simply kept going. In the kitchen, in the Brooklyn studio, in the site visits and the proposals, and the sketchbook stacked in the hall closet. And when the marriage ended, she had taken that ongoing work and pointed it fully in the direction it had always been facing, and the rest had followed. She had not rebuilt herself after losing him. That was the thing Nathan had to sit with. She had not been broken by the divorce and then reconstructed. She had simply been freed of a structure that had been partially obstructing her, and she had expanded into the space the way things expanded when the obstruction was removed. He had been the obstruction, not intentionally, not cruelly, but an obstruction nonetheless. This was not a comfortable thing to know about yourself. Nathan was not under any illusion that knowing it made him a better person retroactively, or that it entitled him to credit for the knowing. But he had committed himself, somewhere in the winter months after the gala, to the practice of seeing clearly, rather than seeing conveniently, and this was part of what clearly looked like. He had not been the protagonist of Elena Hart's story. He had been, at most, a circumstance she had moved through and beyond. And the measure of her was not what she had become after him, as though the story had been waiting for his absence to begin, but what she had always been, the whole time, right there in the room with him, drawing on the kitchen table in the morning light. He saw her once more. Not arranged, not the result of a decision or a plan, but the city, as it always did, folded two lives into the same space without asking anyone's permission. It was a Saturday afternoon in September, 18 months after the gala. He was walking through the West Village with no particular destination, the kind of September afternoon that New York produced occasionally, as though apologizing for the summer, cool and clear, the light doing something specific to the brownstones that he had started noticing, the way things looked at certain times of day. He turned a corner onto a block he knew vaguely, and there she was. She was standing outside a small cafe talking to someone. A woman he didn't recognize, close in age to Elena, with a rolled tube under her arm that said architectural drawings in the particular way that objects named themselves when you knew what they were. They were in the middle of something, a conversation with the momentum of work. Elena was pointing at something on her phone, and the other woman was nodding, making a note. Elena's hair was down. She was wearing a jacket he hadn't seen before. Dark olive, well cut. And she looked, in the September afternoon on that particular block, like someone who was entirely at home in the life she was standing in. Nathan stopped walking. He was on the same sidewalk, maybe 30 feet from her. The natural geometry of the moment would have brought him past her within about 10 seconds if he kept going. He could turn left. He could pull out his phone and appear to be looking at something and take a different route. He kept walking. She saw him when he was maybe 15 feet away. The same thing as the Gala. Immediate, unsurprised, no sharp intake of breath or visible recalibration. She saw him, and she recognized him, and her expression did not perform anything. It was just the face of a person who had encountered someone they used to know and had made their peace with that. "Nathan," she said. "Elena." He slowed, stopped a natural distance away, not close enough to intrude on the conversation she'd been having. "Sorry, I'm not trying to interrupt." "You're not," she said. She glanced at her colleague. "Give me 1 second." The colleague nodded, stepped back slightly, looked at her phone. Elena turned to Nathan. They were standing on the sidewalk in the September afternoon, and he looked at her. Really looked the way he was trying to learn to look at things. And she looked at him, and between them was everything that had happened, and everything that had been said, and the sketchbook on his shelf, and the 2 words on the back of the photograph, and the 10 years before any of it. "How are you?" he said. "Good," she said. "Really good." She said it plainly, without emphasis. Not to make a point about her happiness, but because it was simply true. "You?" "Getting there," he said. She smiled at that, not warmly exactly, but genuinely. The smile of someone who understood the sentence and was not unsympathetic to it. "I got the letter," she said. "I know. Thank you for responding. You didn't have to." She looked at him for a moment. "I know I didn't have to." She paused. "It was a good letter, Nathan." He held that. "I meant it." "I know you did." She glanced back at her colleague, who was still patient but visibly present. "I have to get back to—" "Of course," he said immediately. "I didn't mean to." "You didn't." She looked at him one more time, the same way she had at the Gala, steady and unhurried, but different now in the specific way that things were different after accounting had been done. Not closed, just complete. "Take care of yourself." "You too," he said. She turned back to her colleague and they resumed their conversation, Elena pointing at the phone again, the other woman nodding. And Nathan walked on down the block. He walked half a block and then stopped on the sidewalk and stood for a moment, not because he needed to look back, he didn't, but because he needed a second to let the moment be what it was, which was nothing dramatic, which was 2 people who had shared a decade of their lives, encountering each other on a Saturday in September and saying true things to each other without cruelty, and that being enough. That being actually more than most people got. He thought about the thing Patricia Sohn had said at the Gala about Elena's design philosophy, about temporal flow, about how a building guided your experience not through the space it provided, but through the time it organized. He thought about his own life that way, not as a collection of positions and possessions and relationships arranged in space, but as a sequence of moments that had moved in a direction and what that direction had been, and whether it was possible to change the direction without pretending the earlier direction hadn't existed. He thought it was possible. He thought that was the thing. Not erasure. You didn't erase the 10 years or the choices or the consequences. You carried them, honestly, as the accumulated weight of a life actually lived, and you kept moving, and the direction you moved in from this point was the one you chose now, with clearer eyes than you'd had before. That was what the sketchbook had given him in the end. Not absolution, not a way back, just clarity about where he stood and what he was responsible for and what he was allowed still to want. Elena Hart walked back to her work on the other side of the city, carrying what she'd built and building more. She moved through the world with the ease of someone who had done the work of knowing herself. Not perfectly, not without cost, but genuinely, in a way that held up. And the world was responding to that with the recognition she'd always deserved. Nathan Caldwell walked uptown in the September light with his hands in his jacket pockets, and the sketchbook was at home on his shelf, and the photograph was still in the inside pocket of his jacket. He had moved it there from the Brioni, had kept it with him the way you kept things that were telling you something you still needed to hear. And ahead of him was the rest of his life, which was not the version he had planned and not the version he would have chosen, but which was honest in a way his previous version had not been. He was going to pay attention, not perfectly. He was not going to be transformed into a man without blind spots or failures or the particular stubbornness of someone who had spent 43 years being a specific kind of person. But he was going to try, with actual effort, to see the things in front of him. The light in September, the people in the room with him, the work that mattered, and the difference between looking at something and seeing it. That was what it came down to. That was the only real thing. You had to be in the light to know what it changed, and you had to be paying attention to know you were in it. He walked on. The city opened up around him, enormous, indifferent, full of 10,000 ordinary Saturdays happening all at once. And somewhere across it, Elena Hart was pointing at a drawing and talking about the way time moved through a building, and it was the best version of herself she had ever been, and she had built that herself, out of years of quiet work and patient vision and the refusal to let not being seen become the same thing as not existing. Some people waited to be recognized before they became who they were. Elena had never waited. She had just kept building, in the kitchen and in the studio and in the sketchbook stacked in the closet, until the world caught up with what she already knew about herself. That was the whole story. That was the only story, really, the one underneath all the other ones. Some people spend their lives waiting for permission to be what they already are. And some people, quietly, without announcement, just get to work. The difference, in the end, was everything.